Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. Excited to be here today and talking to some amazing people. I'm here with my co-host, Rob Ocel, who is an engineer as well at This Labs. Hey, Rob. So you can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Ocel. That's Rob Ocell. And then we have our guest here today, which is Dominic Farolino. Thank you for joining us, Dominic.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and Dominic is a WHATWG standards editor, a Chrome committer, also a student and software engineer. And I feel like you've been basically interning at all the different amazing companies as of late. So it's been really cool to see you jump around.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's been really cool. I was at Mozilla last summer working on Firefox graphics, specifically off main thread painting. I was at Microsoft this past summer, and I'm going to be at Google in Japan this coming summer. So, yep.
Nice. Well, totally coming to visit you to eat yummy foods. For sure. All right. So, and you can follow Dominic on Twitter at it's Dom Farolino, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. There we go. Awesome. Well, so let's go ahead and get started. So Dominic and I actually met at the last, what was it? It was Browser Contributor Days.
Yeah.
And so it's really fun to, again, get your perspective. We gathered around all the different browser vendors, and you were one of the non-biased people in the room, I guess you can say.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So I think maybe first and foremost, so, you've been successful in getting involved in contributing to different standards. And I know a lot of people sort of look at these things. And I remember when I first started development, it's like, okay, who do all the people that I look up to? And so you'd see these standard bodies where people are like, whoa, like I want to be a part of WHATWG or W3C or TC39. Like, this is my dream. And so, you've been successful in actually making that a reality. So can you tell us a little bit about just kind of how and what and why?
Yeah, sure. I think the why probably starts with just a general care of the platform. I thought it was really cool that we kind of have this web platform that we could all develop on, but also easily contribute to. That was really interesting to me. And so I was at the time more interested in frameworks and web app development itself. And I saw that new features and stuff would come to Angular and things would be changing. And then at the same time, I heard other people talking about how the platform's changing and we're getting these new features. I was like, well, that seems kind of interesting, because I wasn't exactly sure who was in charge of that. So I was looking into that a little bit more. I of course came across TC39 and the W3C and the WHAT working group and all the different bodies. I started kind of looking at some of the standards, and I just emailed one of the owners of the organization, one of the lead editors, and I was like, hey, what is this stuff and how do I get involved? And it's kind of cool. And he was like, yeah, sure. Here's some good resources. Check out some of the issues on the standards. And then from there, I kind of just kept contributing to standards. And I thought it was really cool, sort of fostering interoperability on the web and moving some things along. But then I started looking at the browser's implementations of the features. I was getting more interested in the fetch API and like the request object and different things that are exposed to the platform. I was reading the spec, and I was kind of at the same time, another tab, basically reading the Chrome implementation of it and seeing like how exactly one-to-one is it with the spec. The spec says this. How is this looking in the implementation? And I was doing that, and the first time I was doing it, I saw a bug. There was a discrepancy between the spec and what one of the comments in Chrome was doing. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. So I'm gonna see if I can download, Chrome, set it all up, and see if I can fix it. We have a really good test suite called Web Platform Test that we use to test the platform to see if normative changes have been made. And so when I changed the C++ implementation to match what I believe the spec should be, I saw that a test lit up and kind of started passing. I was like, oh, cool. So I submitted a change request to Chrome, and I saw that most of the people in charge of that area were in Tokyo working on fetch and some of the networking stuff in Chrome. So those are the people I originally started looking up to when it comes to the actual implementation work. All these awesome engineers in Tokyo that I got to work more and more closely with by just contributing code, and then also the standards people at the same time, like Anna Van Kesteren from Mozilla and Dominic Denicola, who helped me get started with some of the specs.
Awesome. So how long did that process take? So you're saying from just sort of being interested and kind of peeking at stuff to, kind of contributing and putting stuff into downloading the source code. I mean, this sounds like a gateway drug, these standards. Like, how long was this process? Did this process take for you?
Yeah, so I started, I guess I cracked open my first web standard probably in maybe November or October of 2017, I think. And at that time, school was obviously really busy. So I was reading and contributing to the console a bit, the console standard. And I was interested in contributing, but things got super busy with school and everything. And then I picked it back up in late November, and I was able to submit my first change request to Chrome in late December of 2017, and I was editor of the console standard by March because I'd been contributing a lot to it, and not many people were active, so I was kind of promoted, if you will.
That's great. And so how did you? I mean, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but how did you arrive at sort of contributing to sort of the What working group? Tracy mentioned TC39, she mentioned W3C, and even amongst those, there's several different working groups or task forces underneath those.
Right.
Kind of how did you land where you landed? Is it just the thing that you're most interested in, or was it just sort of coincidence, just the people you talked to sort of pushed you that way?
Right. So yeah, that's a good question. I'd say the first thing I probably landed across, because like I said, I was more interested in sort of frameworks and app dev at the time. So I came across the TC39 because JavaScript was getting new features, and I was interested in that. If you take one look at the ECMAScript spec, it'll probably make you close the tab and go to something else, especially if you don't know really what you're doing or anything. So I looked at that and I was like, whoa, okay, that's out of my league. I mean, it was interesting and it was really cool, but it was definitely really, really complicated. And so I was like, okay, I kind of dug around and saw that some of the other contributors to it are also contributing to web standards, which was equally interesting to me. Web APIs that were kind of being pushed about. And yeah, so from there, I saw the HTML standard, the fetch standard, and I was looking into a little bit more what the difference was between the W3C and the What working group, because I think the difference, the separation is kind of nuanced. And so it happened to be that the person I saw the most in this area was Dominic Farolino, and he happened to be the owner of the What working group, seemingly more involved, at least on the outside, in the What working group. And so I was just like, this seems to be where the cool kids are landing. So what's it like? So that's probably how it started. Yeah.
Cool. So as far as the What working group, you're getting involved with that. And, for people that maybe don't know, I mean, I know each of these standards bodies is obviously structured a little bit differently. They're staffed a little bit differently or funded a little bit differently,
Sure.
But maybe we could just go into kind of what the What working group looks like a little bit, kind of, how is it structured? Like, who contributes to it? And like, do you guys meet in person, or is it all through GitHub? Kind of, can you explain the process of how What works?
Sure. Yeah. I found it to be a really cool process and different than a lot of the other groups. It's entirely open, like essentially completely decentralized. We use IRC as our main form of chat. It's not primarily a meetings group, so there are no official What working group, like in-person meetings or even hangout meetings and stuff like that. It is basically entirely done over GitHub and IRC and email. It like you said, yeah, it's staffed very differently. The W3C is very organized and to some extent, proprietary and owned a little bit more. It is like a real organization. They've got like things and all that kind of stuff. And there's people that work for them and people that have at W3C email addresses. And for the What working group, it's basically, I remember I'd asked one of the owners on IRC, who's funding this, because it seems very open. Like it's just like anybody can join if they're active enough. And he was like, yeah, basically just one of us just fronts the money for a year and then someone else does the next year. It's very, very unofficial and really interesting how it works. It's like I said, it's very unofficial. It's kind of just like kids meeting in the back of the room almost to work on standards while the main class, the W3C, almost is going on. So it's a lot it's disjointed and very unorganized, and as a result, I think very fast moving and sharp. And there's not as much, I guess, red tape or politics going involved. In fact, in just the past year, that What working group was able to get like official agreements with Microsoft because they had counsel that was sort of doctoring them through this stuff, which is a big step forward.
I had a quick question. So so if you had to compare, I guess, those two groups versus TC39, and you know, we talk about one having more red tape than the other, or one being, you know, less, I would say, I don't know about organized, but red tapey.
Sure, yeah.
Where would you put TC39? Would you put TC39 on like the more red tape portion of the spectrum?
I don't too much about it. I think it's probably comparable, and I think an answer for me that would probably be potentially naive, and I don't know too much about it, would be probably TC39 at the top, just because, you know, to contribute to W3C, right? Or sorry, the working group, it's completely open. You can just do it however you want. The W3C, there's sort of like memberships, and you can be involved with a company. It's sort of pay to play almost idea. But it's the TC39. It's basically you can't even join the meetings in person unless like a company is sponsoring you. And if a third-party company sponsors you, that's not like already paying the TC39 as a company with a vested interest. If they sponsor you too many times, then you can't go, because then it's like you're kind of going for free almost with not being a part of the actual group. So there seems to be a little bit more of a organization overhead. And like I said, the red tape with how to actually attend to the meetings is actually a little bit more difficult. It's almost like a private group kind of. I think they're trying to open that up a little bit more. At least a lot of the things are becoming more open. But yeah, I know attendance is like a little bit tricky.
Yeah,
comparatively.
I know Dan Ehrenberg. You know, I'm part of this unofficial educators outreach thing with Dan Ehrenberg, where he's really trying to bring in more external voices to TC39, or, you know, what haven't people thought about, like sort of moving back on, okay, well, you know, we released this spec, and you know, okay, this hot mess happened, and how do we not make that happen again, and why did it happen, and you know, where do we go wrong, so that they don't do it again, especially proposals that they're thinking about releasing. That
makes sense. That's definitely pretty common, because a lot of those, you know, problems or hot messes that happen seem to start at the meetings that are almost kind of locked down. So by the time they're public and everyone's talking about them, it seems like a lot of people that aren't super familiar or updated with the process are already behind, and it's harder to kind of catch up and get involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the whole like, okay, everyone use const, okay, everyone use let, okay, and you know, I don't think that they thought it would be such a big, like, you know, traumatizing, not traumatizing, but like thing for the, you know, it's a thing for the JavaScript community.
Yeah.
You know? And they're like,
right, certainly.
What about for, you know, so when I look at the different browsers and, you know, the different standards and things like that, as a JavaScript developer and as other JavaScript developers, I think wonder, as you know, as they want to participate in these things, it seems like you're not actually writing much JavaScript though, right? Like, is that the case?
Yeah. So yes, it is very much the case. It's kind of mixed. So every change that happens to a web standard that is not editorial in nature, you know, not just a mixing up of words that doesn't actually affect an implementation's, you know, conformance, has to be backed by a web platform test for it to be merged into the standard, generally speaking. Web platform tests, it's actually an organization on GitHub, and they have a repository called WPT, and there's a bunch of tests written in there, mostly JavaScript and HTML, because we're testing, you know, APIs, which are typically exposed through JavaScript. But yeah, the actual standards writing is basically just text. You know, it's we write it in something called bike shed, which is basically HTML with some sprinkled in decoratives or directives that can kind of help us with cross-linking and things like that. So it's largely in English.
Rob and I both love that name, by the way, bike shed. Just
bike shed. Yeah. And so yeah, it's largely text and, you know, kind of manipulating the surrounding abstract infrastructure that is the standards. And that's why I think it's pretty difficult, because you jump in and every definition links to 5 other definitions, and every 5 definitions that just keeps linking on, and it's just this very large abstract, you know, block of and body of text. But yeah, the actual writing of the standards is very little JavaScript, and then to back that up with tests, typically you write the test alongside that, or someone else will.
Great. And so, you know, with organizations like the What Working Group, and then you have the browser vendors, right? And so you kind of have like the dog wagging the tail, the tail wagging the dog. Explain a little bit about the relationship between those two groups. I mean, particularly in the case of What, you know, for something to get through What and to be approved or finalized in the standard, does it have to have browser buy-in? Does it have to have implementation already? Or or does one side push the other? Kind of explain how that relationship works.
Yeah, certainly. So assuming we're going to change something in the platform, for example, like an addition or a modification of an API, removals are a little trickier because basically anything you remove can break anyone that uses it. So that requires a lot more metrics and analytics and things. But yeah, additions, modifications, things like that. I've spec'd new APIs and implemented them myself. And generally the process that we follow is actually, it's all available on the What Working Group's website, WHATWG.org. But yeah, so for something to make it into the spec, like I said, it's got to be backed up by tests, and at least 2 of the 4 that we consider main browser vendors have to kind of basically say, yeah, we're going to implement this if you standardize it. So the 4 that we consider accounting right now is Chrome, Edge, Safari, and Firefox. And so yeah, we require 2 implementers interested in the feature, tests backed up by it, and making sure that it's obviously rigorous and hardened. We're starting to look at other implementers, or I guess flexing the definition of what an implementer is, or an interested implementer. Right now, it's just browsers, and it's just those 4. But there are some like Cloudflare's. I think they have like workers, like some sort of thing on the web that kind of implements and adheres to the fetch standard, though they're not a browser vendor. And I think at one point they kind of wanted to make some changes to their implementation and was like, well, we're kind of using the spec, so would we count as a party that could carry weight as far as an opinion goes? And I think there's some conversation about that and getting sort of other vendors involved. But yeah, typically 2 vendors to implement it, and that generally speaking gets the other 2 on board, open up bugs and get approval and merge it in.
Awesome. So is there anything that standards either that you're working on or that you're keeping an eye on? It doesn't even have to be necessarily in what, but that you're interested in? Because I know, like, for me personally, we did a podcast on this a little while ago, but the Houdini task force stuff that they're doing with the low-level APIs and just allowing the user land, like developers, to really play with the guts of the browser and then add the best of that back into the platform. Like, to me, that kind of stuff is super exciting. But is there anything else that you're looking at that kind of like you're watching, just waiting for it to get approved?
Sure. Let's see. So streams and dynamic imports are really interesting. Dynamic import has already been spec'd, but it's not, to my knowledge, available in Firefox yet. Or I think Safari might have an implementation, but Chrome's is the only mostly solid implementation that I think that I know about. So I'm really waiting for that to kind of hit more of a mainstream thing. Static imports have been standardized in TC39, of course, but dynamic is really interesting. And I think, this is kind of always this idea that platform, APIs and plugins are kind of moving ahead and solving the problems that developers are needing, and then the platform catches up and they're like, yeah, these are really cool things. We'll integrate this into the platform. And I think dynamic imports is one of those things. And so I'm really waiting to see that become more mainstream in browsers in general. Streams as well. It has an implementation that's, I believe, nearly finished in Firefox. It is finished in Chrome, and I think that's all that has been working on it so far. Streams are super cool, though. I mean, I think Jake Archibald has a bunch of talks and demos about, basically requesting a large body of text and kind of having the text stream into an HTML element instead of rendering it all at once. I think those are powerful, albeit less pretty primitives than the Houdini. Other than that, some of the stuff that I'm working on currently, I'm doing some refactoring of the HTML standard, but also, so I'm assuming you're familiar with like responsive images, like the source set and sizes, attributes on image, and things like that. So right now, there's not really a good way to preload those images. So I'm standardizing the image sizes and the image source set attribute on the link element, and working with the implementer in Chrome. So we have a spec change up right now. We just requested the technical architecture group, the W3C tag review for that. So that'll be nice to kind of give developers a little bit more power of what they're preloading for their responsive images. But other than that, I'll be able to answer that question better once school's out.
Yeah, for sure. So, I know that there's people out there that, I think that they're interested in these groups for sure, and they want to get involved. And I think like sometimes the gateway for some people getting involved in this is, for example, like a lot of people using RxJS, right? And all of a sudden they hear that there's an observable proposal, both I think in the What Working Group and in TC39. There's the pipeline operator, and people get super excited about this stuff, right? And like they wanna see it, right? They want it now, and they'd love to help. But then they open up one of those standards documents and they're like, I'm not a technical writer, and to be honest, I don't even know that I can understand this. So for people like that, how can they show their enthusiasm? How can they contribute in a positive way? Like, what is the way that they can make some of these standards that they're really excited about a reality?
Yeah, that makes sense. So to catch up with the first point, yes, people are definitely excited about this. I had just spoken at Cascadia JS about web standards, and a surprising number of people were like, "Wow, I never knew it was this open, and I really want to get involved." And I was like, "Seriously? Like most people, most of my friends think it's ridiculous or whatever." But yeah, there's definitely a lot of people that are excited about it and interested in it. And when it comes to those proposals, they're obviously just as well as the specs, quite overwhelming. I mean, the text is immense and really difficult to really parse through if you haven't really seen that kind of stuff before. But there's been a lot of times where we've had developer feedback, and that has been taken into account and actually influenced the overall workings of a spec. I'd say yeah. So if you find like the GitHub issue for like the observable proposal or something like that, a lot of these proposals generally start with like an API sketch and talking about how it would work before we actually go into spec land and really hash it out. And I don't think there's a super concrete proposal for observables yet. So any developers with interest in that, it would be really good to just go out, check out the issue. There's a GitHub thread for it, and basically just be like, yeah, okay, I like this API sketch, or I think this makes sense, or this doesn't make sense, or a lot of these web platform things that we get developer feedback for are kind of the ergonomics of an API. How is it going to feel to use this? If you were to integrate this in a framework that you're using today, what is it going to feel like? Do you like this API? Is it good? And a lot of the spec people, could really use that feedback, because a lot of the standards guys are not generally writing web apps themselves. They're usually working on the standards. So it's always good to kind of get developer relation sort of feedback. So any contributions on that front would probably be the best way to help them move forward.
Well, one thing is, how do the standards bodies, or what have you seen? I've seen it where, it's like, oh, hey, we're going to implement this in this standards body. And then the other standards body is like, well, but, there was another proposal that was very similar. And the fact that you're trying to implement it here is kind of like not cool. Like, how do you deal with all of that? Or is there a lot of that in WHATWG and W3C? Or is that more in more formal things like TC39?
I think that's a pretty good question. I don't have too much experience with that in general. I think a lot of the debate around that kind of stuff happens with like platform primitives. Like, our promise is going to be part of TC39, or is it a web platform thing?
Yeah.
TC39, but streams, why are streams a web API and not in the spec? And same with observables, that could probably just as well make it in TC39 as Rob mentioned. There's of course a TC39 proposal for observables. And so it's kind of, like where do these things actually end up? And for the primitives, that's more of a debate, I think. I haven't experienced that too much. I'm because, like I said, I'm not super involved in the TC39, but it sounds like you've seen that row go about a couple times.
I did see this in the observable proposal, and in the WHATWG one, and then in the TC39 one. But it's interesting because it's like, the people who are passionate about it, I think a lot of times, you try to implement in one, and then if one says no, then you kind of try to implement it in the other. And then if one gets accepted in, let's say WHATWG, then maybe it's more likely to be accepted in TC39. And so it was actually very interesting for me as I was getting into standards and being involved in some of these things, and how much politics there is around it. So,
yeah. No, there is a ton. Yeah. And it's like, it's always more enjoyable to stay as far on the technical side as you can when working on this stuff, especially when you're like, I don't know, roughly new to it. Like, I'm not like, my name doesn't carry a ton of weight. I can't just like influence all these people, so to speak. But yeah, there's a ton of politics involved, and it's kind of like one of those, it's got accepted by this body. So now it's kind of like everyone's like, yeah, we'll take it on actually. And it's like, everybody's a little bit more interested in it once one person approves. That's one thing I definitely want to look into more, is probably the observable proposal. I've seen the GitHub issue, but like I said, I don't think there's a super concrete proposal, and I'd like to understand a little bit more about some of the banterings between.
Yeah, I mean, it's the WHATWG observable proposal. I mean, I guess I actually be curious on how to make it more concrete, because I know it's sitting there as an issue. There's a ton of comments about it.
It's like 100 or something.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, it's just adds like, you know, the on method, right? It's nothing that crazy, and it'll come with a few different operators. So that would be so cool. And if you could help us do that, you know,
Yeah.
the hero arcs.
I'll check it out over winter break, because I was talking to Ben a little bit about how, you know, some of the actual, you know, laying the foundation for the spec work hasn't been done yet. And I would definitely love to get moving forward with that.
We would love you forever. We would buy you a cake.
Oh, well, then that's definitely going to happen then.
Ways to influence Dominic. Yeah. You know, I think another thing that's been interesting to me about, you know, standards and kind of like how they move is it's kind of like, what's the squeaky wheel? Who's talking about it?
Right.
You know, who's causing the most amount of whatever. And that can be like a negative thing or a positive thing. But regardless of whether it's negative or positive, it still gets attention. And
yeah,
I guess that's how our world works.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And it's nice to see some of the, you know, the framework authors be, you know, be some of the squeaky wheels in that sense. I know we had the primitive, the API Q micro task was starting to be standardized and tested because of some people on the Angular team were like, yeah, we can really use this. And like that, it was in the spec. I mean, it was pretty quick. There was some pushback and stuff, but yeah, it made it through no problem. And so it's nice to see that, you know, the platform's at least adapting to some of the ergonomics that the framework authors have sort of let developers get used to and things like that. But yeah, it's definitely squeaky wheel gets the grease, and yeah, for sure.
So playing off of that, because it sounds like as a group, the What working group actually moves quite quickly. But I know when people think about standards, it's actually they more often think about slowness. You know, like especially like ECMAScript, right? You can go 10 years, 6 years between versions of the spec, and
right.
I know sometimes people just wait and wait and wait for things, and then even after they're spec'd, they wait for implementation. So, do you think that the What working group has been a good example of how to accelerate that process, or do you have any opinions or any thoughts that you've come up with as to, you know, how that process could be sped up, or how people might be able to help that process speed up?
Yeah. So that's what's nice about the What working group. It's probably, you know, the biggest bottleneck I've seen has, I mean, there's obviously red tape and going to be, you know, some slow moving things everywhere. And yes, standards are historically slow moving in general. But yeah, the biggest bottleneck that I've seen in the What working group is just basically finding the bodies to throw at a new project and to actually get the work done. A lot, like I said, a lot of it's open source. A lot of people are just contributing out of free time. Some of the core owners of the group work at some of the major browser vendors and are responsible for speccing some of this stuff. But yeah, like with observables, this is like a really cool primitive that can make it into the platform. And probably, you know, one of the main reasons it's not moving forward right now is just because, you know, a lot of people are backed up and they'll get to it when they get to it, kind of thing. Which is why.
It's a champion situation, right? Like in TC39, for example, Joffer, who was championing it before through Netflix, that's kind of why, you know, all the ArcsJS stuff, ArcsJS 5 and up stuff started. But, you know, sometimes it's not because it's not interesting to people. Like for us, the biggest thing has been, okay, number one, you know, Chrome folks, for example, right? Like Dominic and Nicole and those folks did not have enough context about why this was important to the language.
Yeah, that's also pretty important. Yeah, for sure.
So it's like you have to spend time educating people on why it's important. And then you also have to have like a consistent champion. And if those people, you know, leave jobs or anything like that, or priorities within a business changes, like you know, Netflix, you know, made some changes to what they were focusing on from an open source perspective, then all of a sudden something that is actually important that would actually be very useful to the language, you know, nobody's talking about it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really hard to find the time. I was actually just looking at the HTML standard the other day. If you look at the contributors, the top 3 people are Ian Hickson, the people that have had the most commits. Ian Hickson, who works at Google, used to be the basically like author, editor, and owner of all the What working group stuff. Has like 8,000 something commits to it. There's 10,000 roughly on the standard. Dominic and Nicole has, I think, like 300 something, or maybe that's Anna Van Kesteren, and Dominic and Nicole has 300 or something. It's below 1,000, and then below that it's just like a big decline. And so most of the work being done on that kind of front is just by like a handful of people. So it's like, you know, if you can catch one of these people when they're really interested in something, or their work is prioritizing it accordingly, that's when it's primarily going to get done. And that's why I'm just trying to contribute as much as I can, because it's super interesting, but there's a lot of work to be done. So any hands help.
I think it's also really amazing that you're helping contribute to, you know, open source in general, right? Like these, it's, you know, it's not very often that we have time in our lives to, you know, to do amazing things. And, you know, the fact that, you know, you have the opportunity right now and you can start contributing and helping to these things and sort of, you know, making an impact in the world, right? Like that's a really cool thing that we're able to do. And I love that, you know, everything is open and the only thing that's holding you back is just like starting.
Yeah, it's really true. The biggest, you know, bottleneck, I guess, would be yourself, unfortunately. But yeah, no, it's really cool. I mean, it's all open and it's really addicting. I guess, as Rob mentioned, it's very much a gateway drug into getting involved. It's super cool. And once you get involved, I mean, like I said, I have a really hard time stopping myself. So yeah, it's awesome. But the hardest thing is probably starting, and that requires just, yeah, grinding through a lot of the spec work and just kind of understanding what's going on. But that's why I'm trying to make myself in general, I guess, as accessible as possible. You know, when I emailed Dominic about getting involved and stuff, I was like, wow, that was like really easy. He kind of pointed me what to do. I mean, ultimately I had to read the stuff and do the work, but like it was pretty nice, which is really inspiring for me to go out and give a talk about it and throw my email address out and be like, hey, contact us, you know, IRC, email me if you have questions about getting involved, and I'll do whatever I can to start the process.
Cool. You know, one of the last questions I had, and just something I was thinking about when I was thinking about this standards process and kind of how more people could get involved, especially people like I know people that they're not standards minded, or they might not have anything to add. Maybe they do have something to add, but they just feel like they don't. And they feel like they see these big names that they've seen at, you know, Google I/O or, you know, all the different vendors conferences. And they're like, who am I to even suggest something to these people?
Sure.
But like, besides that, and besides getting involved and just sort of mixing with that, I was curious if you thought that there was anything to be done on the side of making it easier to see what the groups are working on. I mean, obviously everything's out in the open, but sometimes it can actually be really difficult to navigate the list of open issues or to see what specs are hot and active versus which ones have been sort of sitting around for a few months. Do you think that there's room there, or do you have any ideas on ways that people could contribute to kind of help organize or advertise some of the things that are being worked on to kind of solicit more people to get involved?
I definitely, yeah, I do think there's work there because, you know, a lot of the efforts dedicated to that kind of stuff right now is basically around, you know, working on the stuff. But as a result, unless you're also working on that stuff or very, very closely following it, you don't know what is hot, like you said, and what's moving forward. I don't have any great ideas on how to handle that, but I think what could be done is some sort of almost maybe like priorities or recent active kind of thing dashboard, where we could just see like, you know, this proposal, this pull request is really getting a lot of attention these days, or these issues are really moving forward, and these issues are kind of falling behind, and just to see kind of what is being contributed to a lot. I imagine that would be a relatively simple thing to build, and I'm sure the WHAT working group would be open to it, and it would be very helpful. That's a really good point though, because I think a lot of people could benefit from just because, especially when it comes to providing feedback to the platform, a lot of times you don't know what to provide feedback to or what you want to talk about. But if you see a lot of people are talking about this and you're like, yeah, maybe my voice can be heard in this particular realm, some sort of you know, thing that, yeah, almost like a, you know, like we're trying to get this done this quarter kind of thing would be, you know, relatively helpful. I don't know how something like that would be implemented, but I'm absolutely open to hearing other people's ideas on it or anyone to talk about that, because I think that'd be really interesting and helpful.
Yeah, cool. Because like I said, I mean, some of the standards that I've heard the most about are ones that people I know about are championing, right? And so it's like, I know that they might not even be the ones that have the most heat. And so sometimes, you know, when we're talking to people now and they're like, hey, this is, like I said, the Houdini thing was a perfect example of this. I didn't really know that it was out there. And all of a sudden I found out about it. I'm like, why is nobody talking about this, right? There's more things like that. So I think, you know, it's probably a call to anybody that's listening to this. You know, you don't necessarily have to write the technical script. You might not have to write the implementation, but if you find something and you're interested in it, you know, maybe reach out to the champions, reach out to the editors, see if there's any way that you can help get the word out or write a blog post or something just to kind of help them, you know, just sort of get the word out and get more people interested, because, you know, that could be maybe super useful to this process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Tracy said, I mean, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So the more voices you can get on a certain topic, you know, generally speaking, the more attention it's going to get. I'm wondering if maybe, you know, making more liberal use of the WHAT working group's Twitter handle would be, you know, useful for that. I know there's some sort of expository tweets about, hey, you know, this is really a nice ergonomic thing that's happening in the specs. So if you're writing specs, you know, you could take advantage of this new sort of thing that we added. But it would be almost, yeah, it would be kind of cool to be taking more advantage of that and saying like, yeah, we're really working on this proposal. Let us know what you think here. And then just have people follow What Working Group on Twitter. And maybe I'm wondering that could be, that might be one of the better ways to help. That's an interesting thought there. Thanks for bringing that up. I'll definitely be looking into that more.
New project.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, yes. So you've inspired me to create some sort of GitHub bot that spams the observable proposal on What Working.
Yes, the standards bot on Twitter. Yeah, it's funny because the What Working Group has a Twitter account for every standard that it has, but it only tweets automatically on commits to master when something is merged. However, I think it would be interesting to maybe, obviously not tweet on every single pull request or something like that, but tweet on some of the hot ones, or have someone kind of have like a little bit more of a manual approach on that would be pretty interesting to get the word out of some things.
So awesome. Well, we're super happy you joined us today. It's been really cool again to see all the cool things you're doing. And we're definitely we're planning out our 2019 right now. So it'll be really fun to talk to you about, some of the new upcoming things that we have going on.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So again, you can follow Dominic on Twitter at Dom Farolino, and you can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Ocel. And my name is Tracy again. You can follow me on Twitter at Lady Leet. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast.